I think the future, almost philosophically, is thought of as this place we are going towards collectively. And maybe one day we all get there and it doesn't change, which is just ludicrous.
Yeah,
I mean,
nonsense.
we all experience the present in a different way. We'll always all experience the future in a different way. And it's, we never get there as such. And also, whenever we do get somewhere, like right now, we can change it. If we really don't like the way that the AI is going, we can change it. It's not outside of our power. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's not much we can't change if we really, really, really wanted to.
We're going through something absolutely historic.
Technologies across the board are growing exponentially.
It's a disruption that's going to completely redefine the way businesses compete.
In the next decade, we're going to lose 40% of today's Fortune 500 companies.
The exponential growth of computing is continuing.
AI is nowhere near its full potential.
Whether you like it or not, that the future cannot be stopped by anyone.
So welcome back to the Future Tech and Foresight podcast. So as I set up in the very beginning of all this, every episode is going to mostly focus on a different emerging and powerful technology every week. So not only do I think it's important to have a kind of more diverse understanding of what is really coming our way, but of course, due to the kind of exponential nature of our modern technological growth, individuals and organizations today can, I really think, far too easily be blindsided if too much focus is given to a single technology or to a single sector. But this is, I think, only one side of the podcast coin, if you will. The other side of this is trying to answer some questions like, what are we going to do with this knowledge, and how can we shape the future if we have a better idea of what is going on today? So that's why I've brought on my guest today, Richard Watson. He is a futurist speaker, author, and scenario thinker who helps organizations to think further ahead, especially about emerging growth opportunities and risks. So in the episode today, we talk about what is a futurist, how can we best think about the future, and how to overcome our collective sense of future shock. And we also really dive into a detailed MegaTrends map that Richard put out a while ago as a way of helping to navigate the current and coming disruptions that will impact most of us. So just a little bit about Richard. He has worked with Tech Foresight Practice at Imperial College London and London Business School, and is co-founder, along with philosopher Professor Roger Steare and strategist Nick Turner, of Thinking Aloud, a 24-hour retreat for the non-stop noise of working life. Richard is also the author of 5 best-selling books, including Digital versus Human. He is currently futurist in residence at the Entrepreneurship Center at the Judge School at Cambridge University. And if you want to see more of what Richard has produced and has to offer, I highly recommend you check out his website, where not only this MegaTrends map, but many other documents that he has prepared can be seen. And the website is nowandnext.com. So it was great to have Richard onto the podcast, especially bringing on somebody who is also a futurist and has had a little bit more experience in this industry than me. And I think that the conversation is both very interesting, but also brings about a number of very relevant and poignant talking points that I think many of you will enjoy. So without further ado, I'll bring Richard on. Great. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for coming onto the podcast today. For me, it's great to finally have a futurist that doesn't touch on one specific subject, but maybe a little bit more of a broad overview. So it's great to touch on like all of these mega trends and technologies that you and I both have been following, but just generally it's great to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks, Mark. It's taken us a while, but it's good to be here.
Yeah. So I think maybe the first kind of question to start off with, I've touched on it on the podcast a number of times before. I think I even had it described in the introduction, but kind of just what is a futurist?
Broadly, it's somebody that thinks about the future. I would tend to say distant future, although, funny enough, I was having a discussion a few years ago with a science fiction writer friend of mine called Lavi Tidar, and we were saying, what is the future for the practical purpose of writing? And his answer, which was quite a good one, which is when things start to get weird. And then we sort of looked at each other and we went, hard to imagine that it can get much weirder than it currently is. I mean, technically, I've always felt it's not really futurist, it's futurologist. And the reason I say that is, futurism was an art movement in the early 1900s. Although it's really interesting because they're kind of similar. Those futurists were massively into technology. They're into speed. They quite like war. They loathed libraries. They weren't too fond of women. And actually, if you were being naughty, you could draw some parallels with a lot of modern futurists that are obsessively focused on tech and doing things fast, and maybe not the women bit so much, although there's a bias in a lot of tech. But so yeah, I think it's really just sort of thinking about the distant future. So it's a little bit more than just extrapolating what's currently going on.
Yeah, and well, thanks for the definition, for the explanation. And what was kind of the first thing that got you interested in thinking about the future, thinking about foresight in general?
Philip, I've been asked this question a few times, but I've never given you the answer. Given the answer I'm going to give you, which is
awesome.
A long time ago, which 25 years ago, probably. I met a product industrial designer called Richard Seymour from a company called Seymour Powell. And he was, for no reason, he was talking about these Japanese toilets that were sort of measuring your urine and doing all these, the lid lifts up by itself and, get hot air blown up your ass, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, wow, I've never heard of that. That's amazing. And that kind of got me going down the path initially. But the really big thing, which I have mentioned before, I met a guy who, I don't know if he died literally 10 days ago, called Napier Collins, who ex-Shell guy who set up the best business I've ever come across, Global Business Network, GBN, in California, English guy. And I met him in a bar in Paris and we just got talking. He was the first person that mentioned scenario thinking to me. So he was pretty influential.
Okay, interesting. Maybe also another question here is, when I've talked to other futurists, there's always such a heavy focus on technology, of course, right? It seems to be the kind of main element of our civilization that transforms things the quickest to the widest scope. But there's also, within these steep categories, there's also other things like the economy, society, culture, etc. Do you find that most futurists are maybe a little bit too focused on technology simply because it has such a profound impact?
Way too focused. This is a fundamental mistake with most bits of futurology. It just looks at tech, and I'm not for a minute suggesting that tech isn't important, but tech lives within a very complex system where things interact. So first of all, you have history. I'm a fan of going backwards before you go forwards, and historians make wonderful futurists because they tend to see these patterns and deep drivers. You've got government and politics and regulation. You got pricing. The environment, legal stuff, ethical stuff, demographics, hugely important. There's a problem with tech at the moment because it's being designed by people in their 20s, generally young white blokes, middle-class blokes, who really have no idea what's inside the head of an 85-year-old woman, I would suggest.
Right.
And geopolitical stuff, even geography and geology have an influence. And I think you have to consider all of these different factors.
Right. Well, I think that leads into one of the things that I've been discussing, maybe debating over the last couple of years also, is this idea of the future being constructed or whether it is determined, right? There's I think a large segment of the population even that thinks that, technology is just going to arrive, right? It's just going to be there no matter what happens in society. It's gonna come around, and I think that kind of fits within this techno-deterministic perspective. What are your thoughts on? I mean, maybe you already touched on it a little bit in the previous one, but what are your thoughts on this kind of constructivist perspective versus the deterministic idea of the future coming about?
I think it's both. It is predetermined in some ways. For example, geology ain't changing. Geography doesn't change that much. I mean, we do, if you take a long enough perspective, we do move, boundaries on maps around a fair more than you think, actually, but it's relatively fixed. I would argue that human nature is fixed. Some people would argue very strongly that it absolutely isn't. But I think we haven't changed much since we crawled out of caves. I mean, it reminds me of that E.O. Wilson, the American evolutionary biologist, the Ant-Man, who said, if I can remember it, we've got the brains of the Paleolithic, the institutions of the medieval, and the technology of the gods. And he wasn't being terribly complimentary, by the way. And then you've got a bunch of stuff that we can't do anything about. It just sort of, there's nothing I can do about nuclear weapons. I can't uninvent them, or as an individual, I might help restrain them. But I do think the future is more constructed than we assume. And I think one of the reasons people are quite anxious at the moment, and even depressed actually, is they just see it as that's the future. In fact, I know a guy who was doing an essay at university, and they were asked to write essays about whether the future was open or closed, and everyone just wrote closed, as in we're all doomed. And I think that is absolutely nonsense. And I don't know how you get out of bed if you genuinely think that. There was a great piece of graffiti on the wall of the Sorbonne in Paris in May '68. I've never been able to find a photograph of this, by the way. If any of your people listening to this can find me an original photograph of this, I will send them a book or a bottle of champagne. It broadly said, and it's in French, and my French is appalling. It broadly said, the future contains whatever we put into it today or now or something like that. And that's the history of human civilization, right? I mean, it's individuals seeking to change things. And it's, I think the future almost philosophically is thought of as this place we are going towards collectively. And maybe one day we all get there and it doesn't change, which is just ludicrous.
Yeah, nonsense.
We all experience the present in a different way. We'll always experience the future in a different way. And it's, we never get there as such. And also whenever we do get somewhere, like right now, we can change it. If we really don't like the way that the AI is going, we can change it. It's not outside of our power. I'm not saying it's easy, but there's not much we can't change if we really, really, really wanted to.
Yeah, and maybe this kind of fits in. We might talk about it later on, but of course, the whole AI buzz that's going on right now with Elon Musk and this paper that was put out to put a pause on the AI increasing past GPT-4, like the level past GPT-4. So it does sound like there's of course little examples of individuals, groups of people trying to change certain things about this perspective of technology, but to me, in even my day-to-day conversations with people that aren't really paying attention to technology all that much, there's this definite sense that things are just going to happen. They kind of, I think, feel powerless a lot, maybe because they are so distanced from it. And then one other term that I want to throw in, which I know that you're familiar with, is the sense of future shock. Right, things are happening so fast all the time. It's just completely overwhelming, and there's nothing that they can do individually, but also there's almost no way for them to grasp what's happening now, and of course what's going to happen in 5, 10, not even 20 years in the future.
Yeah, I mean, well, it wasn't funny really, but I wrote a chapter in a book called Aftershock, which was future shock, I guess 50 years on. Does that maths work?
Yeah.
And a month and a half after it came out, the pandemic hit, and I don't think a single person in the book wrote about pandemics. I mean, I should probably explain Future Shock just in case. It is quite an old book, and so it's Alvin and Heidi Toffler. People forget about this. I think 1970 from memory, and it's worth reading. Actually, I've got a really old copy. It's worth rereading now, and my understanding of it is that the general premise is that the perception, and that's such an important word, the perception of too much change over too short a period of time creates a kind of mental instability. And I think that is where we are right now. And you do look back and you think, why on earth were people so wound up and crazy and about change back in the early 70s? But, we forget there was a lot going on. We had the birth of terrorism. We had an oil crisis, the birth of a lot of tech that we take for granted these days. There were a lot of geopolitical shifts going on. But yeah, compared to now, it was relatively calm. And I think that there is an awful lot of anxiety around at the moment, and it predates the pandemic and Ukraine and all the rest of it. And I do think genuinely there's just too much going on, and people feel they don't, as you said earlier, they don't have control over things. There's no certainties, there's no sort of anchor points. They've all sort of come undone slightly. And it varies. I mean, I think that's more true with older people, and it depends on demographics and psychographics. So some people don't feel like that at all, but I think an awful lot of people do. I mean, it's interesting. I think last year, anxiety was the children's word of the year, and clearly that's got a lot to do with climate change and the pandemic and Ukraine, but it's other stuff too. It's, the pressure of education and, what social media is doing and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's still it's probably the most famous futurist book ever written, and rightly so to some extent.
Yeah. So would you say that maybe part of a futurist job, maybe not so much on an individual level, but maybe more at a corporation or an organization level, is to help the people in these places, but also the organization, like the culture of itself, become familiar with the idea of future shock, and then maybe give some scenarios or some ideas to get out of the sense of future shock? Or is it just that things are so overwhelming now that we just all have to kind of become accustomed to the sense of future shock because it's not going to go away?
Well, it could go away. Again, you're doing a linear extrapolation there, if I may be so bold. But I think we are going to have to get more used to it. I don't see the world getting any simpler or less volatile or less complex anytime soon. Although it is entirely possible that we all decide to disconnect at scale, and localization within geopolitics. There's too much information flying around, too much opinion, and I think that's putting people on edge quite a bit. There are strategies to deal with it. I think you've got to have an open mind. You've got to be prepared to change it, and you've got to try and be sort of agile and stuff. But the other thing I think that helps with the anxiety is having a very strong sense of who you are and what you believe in and what you're against. And if you've got that strong sense of self as an individual or an organization, you can sort of weather the storm. But if you're not quite sure who you are, you get sort of tossed around. I mean, the situation was described to me. In fact, we were having a discussion about why nobody's really doing scenario planning at the moment. I mean, they are, but not to the scale. It's sort of fallen out of fashion a bit. And I think we're all in this sort of boat that's leaking in a storm, and the mast's broken, and we're being tossed around. And I'm sort of at the front, maybe looking with binoculars, saying I've just spotted some land, and everyone's saying, "Forget that, just help bail the water out. We'll deal with that later on." So I think we do have to have strategies to deal with that. I mean, I think that the dirty little secret, from my perspective, around futures is it's not really about the future at all. I mean, I've thought long and hard about what I do. A lot of sort of speaking and lecturing around the world, and why are they inviting me over? And I think partly I'm something a bit of fun, and I tell good jokes, and I'm sort of, almost stand up from time to time. It's just sort of relieves a bit of tension, and I'm just entertainment. Other times, and then most of the time, there's always a tiny bit of that, but I think most of the time people want a view of where things are going, and specifically where are they going, and their kids, their family, whatever, because that's sort of reassuring. Now, if you think about it, chances are I'm going to be wrong in quite a significant way, potentially, but that doesn't seem to concern them. As long as somebody's telling them with some confidence that this is happening, they seem better. Really what it's all about from my perspective, and this isn't so much about speaking, although I think it's true with speaking, but if you start getting into scenario work or something, it's an excuse to get people to stop what they're doing temporarily and to think very, very deeply about what they're doing and why and where they're going and whether that's where they want to go. Because I think people are so caught up in the day-to-day, putting out fires, responding to short-term problems, that the ability to sit and just stare out of a window for a few days or a week is pretty rare. And people generally seem to quite like it, actually. And quite often it's just a question of finding out what the question is as well. What do you want to know exactly, and why do you want to know that? And if you knew the answer to that, would you be reassured, and so forth? I mean, some things, you can be pretty confident that's going to happen. Other things, not so much. And the scenario mindset, I think, is another way of becoming less anxious. I mean, disconnection is something that I'm doing myself. I mean, I've done a lot of extreme risk work, and that can mess with your head. So I tend not to read daily newspapers. Somebody called this retrospective reading recently. So I get the New York Times and the Financial Times at the weekend, when people have got more time to write and it's more analytical, and I read them a week or two late when I'm in a calmer mindset. They're easier to scan. You can see better connections. But going back to the scenario thinking mindset, I mean, what's the one thing we know with absolute certainty about the very distant future that becomes more and more true the further out you go? And I think that's, putting aside death and taxes, which I know people that can sort both of those potentially, it's the fact it's uncertain. And if the future's uncertain, there are multiple futures out there waiting to evolve. So this idea that there isn't just one future out there, there are several, and we need to sort of deal with that and be ready for that one versus that one. And that can make you more nervous, or it can calm you down. I think, generally speaking, it tends to calm you down.
And that it also sounds like that enables people to maybe come to hold the reins a little bit of their own future, right? If they perceive the future to be this plethora of possibilities, it's like, oh well, I can choose this, and I can in some sense create it either for myself or for my work, for my business, etc.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of bordering into stoicism, which I think is all the rage in Silicon Valley at the moment, which is great on one level, because why are you worrying about things you can't control? I can't control whether or not there's a global financial crash next month, so I'm not going to really engage with that too much. I'm just going to worry about what I can influence and change. But on the other hand, if you take that too far, nobody ever does anything. Nobody ever changes anything or gets involved with anything. So it's like most things. You just got to get a healthy balance between those two things.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Maybe we can make it a little bit more tangible now, right? So the reason that I initially reached out to you was because I saw your MegaTrend map that you had designed, and it looks like a kind of subway system in a city. As we talked about before, I'll have it kind of superimposed here on the video. But for people that are interested, the link will also be in the show notes. Can you just kind of describe how people should be looking at this? Because I think upon first glance, it's a little bit overwhelming, right? There's so many different lines, there's so many different intersections. The words are kind of everywhere, but I'm sure there's some sort of order to the chaos.
Yeah,
there.
I mean, I should probably explain its history first. I was writing. I used to live in Australia, and I was writing on the kitchen table when my kids were really small. I was writing a Word document on global trends, which was almost sending me to sleep. It was so boring and nothing connected. So I got the kids colored pencils out, and I started sort of doodling this kind of mind map, really, that looks a bit like the sort of London Underground or the New York subway or something. And this was 2006 or something. So this is almost predates data visualization infographics, early days. And I shoved it up online and got this amazing reaction. I think partly because it was visual, and we've moved into more of a visual culture. It sort of had a narrative. And it was quite intriguing. I mean, as you say, it's extraordinarily complex. Although one of the points on the map is too much information, so there's even a little joke there. Essentially, you've got coloured lines, which, for example, red is tech. I think society is yellow. You've got economy, you've got transport, you've got education, work, and so on. In the middle, which is kind of where you start, the middle is kind of now. You've got some big blobs, which are the mega trends. And then you go out and you've got some smaller blobs or dots, which are the micro trends. And then you've got some triangles, which are kind of provocations. So the general idea is that the further out you go, the more provocative it gets and the more future it gets. Okay. The way it's misread is a lot of people say, oh, that's the future. No. That is different futures, different routes for travel for consideration. Yeah. And there's even a sort of little bit of small print saying that, these things can always move and change and so on. And it's trying to sort of get towards the interplay of factors a bit. There are some, I mean, it's quite tongue in cheek because, you can't predict the future, right? I mean, the aim is to be less wrong, as somebody once very cleverly said. You're never going to be 100% right. So it's got lots of little jokes on it. It's got things that are going extinct. It's got some global game changes at the bottom, which were actually frighteningly accurate, given that this was done in late 2016, published in early 2017. And it's to provoke conversation and dialogue and debate. It's meant to wind people up to some extent, which I think is the whole point of a provocation, is to sort of get a reaction. They're not necessarily serious, but we can have a sort of rich discussion. If I say physical money is going to vanish, that gets us into a quite interesting discussion space. And I've been doing them at least once a year ever since. I got hired by Imperial College. They have a Tech Foresight Practice, and they got me in on the back of one of those maps. And I did some maps with them. We did the future of urban air. We did a table of 100 disruptive technologies where we ranked them time against impact. So people seem to quite like them. I mean, I'm running out of ways to visually present information and trends these days, or provocations. I mean, I've used solar systems, I've used periodic tables, I've used subway maps from around the world. So I may have to stop quite soon, but I quite like doing them. And my dad was a physicist, my mum was an art teacher, so I guess that's where they've come from.
Right. I'm also so okay. Maybe if I can read out a couple of these things here,
Mm.
because to make it a little bit more tangible for the audience, right? So I have some larger the larger dots here. We got like uncertainty, connectivity, the rise of Africa, um, decline of trust, population growth, right? So there's of course many others, but given your history and working on this for a while, are there any of those that kind of pop out as not just the ones that I mentioned, but any of those that seem to be more prominent
Yeah.
than some of the others now? I mean,
Um,
it's been almost what, 20 years or so close
I
to it.
I should explain by the way that a lot of this doesn't come out of nowhere. This is very well
Mm,
researched from McKinsey, Frost and Sullivan, Ernst and Young, Department of Defense, what have you. But certain things I felt like decline of trust was lacking, so I added those. I mean, yes, I think as you said right at the beginning, the focus is on tech. So
mm,
yeah, okay, you can worry yourself to death about AGI or quantum computing. I think demographics is the most interesting thing on there. Partly because it's the most certain. We
mm,
know what the demographics is going to look like in 20 years' time because they're already alive and they're not going to move very far. I mean, short of a pandemic that's really lethal or total war or something, we've got a pretty good idea of what India versus China looks like in 2030 or 2050. Within demographics, the critical one globally is aging,
yeah.
societal aging, and we are responding very badly to that, with some exceptions. I mean, MIT are all over this and a few other people, but and that's because most organizations are run by people in their, the boards are in their 50s, 60s. You'll struggle to find somebody over 40 in a marketing department. Most people that work in tech are in their 20s, 30s. So trying to understand what is in somebody's head, as I said earlier on, that's 85, that's going shopping. You can't read half the packaging, you can't open half the packaging, there's nowhere to sit down, you've got no teeth, so you can't eat that stuff, whatever. And then you've got declining fertility. So people are not dying like they used to, but they're equally not being born like they used to. So if you put those two together, I would argue that I don't care whether you are Google DeepMind or Walmart, the most important thing you should be worrying about going forward is how to attract and retain human talent.
Mm,
Bar anything else, forget AGI. As I said, worry about that. Don't ignore it, but keep an eye on it. But I think the demographic piece is more interesting and more important. The number of people living alone or in twos rather than fours has implications. So that's a sort of a big one. We know, I mean, everyone knows about global population growth, but the key thing to me is it's not how many people there are, it's where they are and how they're living. And it's the growth of the global middle class is more important than the growth of population. It's people with money and where are they and what are they spending it on. And also bear in mind that by about mid-century, it looks like this could fall off a cliff in terms of population growth. I mean, it's going into steep reverse unless China suddenly starts having 3 kids per couple. And Musk was absolutely bang on about this. We are soon going to be facing a shortage of humans, which to my mind is why we're getting AI, automation, robotics. I mean, Japan is the fastest aging country on earth. It's no accident that they're really into their robotics and automation,
right.
because there are not enough people in Japan to look after the older people, so use robotics. So that's a really, really interesting one.
Could you so I've looked in this about 1 or 2 months ago. I think even before Musk was talking about it, I listened to Peter Zahan, I believe, is one of these global thinkers. But could you maybe hammer down a little bit on kind of the impacts, the negative impacts of this decline in aging, or the decline in population, I think, in general? Because I think those, like, there's so many different impacts, but I don't think when I have conversations with people, they fully understand how disruptful this is actually going to be.
There's a great book. I can't remember. There's a woman wrote it, American. I cannot remember what it was called, but it was all about this. Well, there's a number of things. First of all, until now, and things can always change, but up to this moment, population growth, and particularly the number of young people in a population, is a critical driver of productivity. Number of people in the workforce. So if that's declining, technically you're in trouble. Again, I mean, that's why China's so interested in a lot of this technology, because China is aging really fast. Everyone thinks it's kind of Japan or Europe or something, but China is aging so fast. So you get things like productivity impacts. I would argue you get less innovation, or at least the innovation shifts to where the younger people are. So I'm thinking here of Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that book. Three drivers of shifts in scientific paradigm, which I think apply to innovation generally, are, from memory, young people, not me, maybe you. I don't know how you are. You're probably okay. I'm finished. It's cross-fertilizations of disciplines, and experience, and it's accidents, it's serendipity. So, okay, so if you focus on that first one, where are the younger people in 2050? They sure as hell aren't in Europe. They're not in Japan. They're not in Korea. They're not in China. They are broadly in sub-Saharan Africa, hence the rise of Africa on the map, with pockets in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and so on. But broadly, it's sub-Saharan Africa. And I forget the percentage, but the number of sort of new births that are going to come out of sub-Saharan Africa in the next couple of decades is just phenomenal. So that's a big one. Another one is probably older people are generally more conservative. They are unlikely to be protesting on the streets. They're incapable of fighting wars. If you're sort of 70, 80 or 90, your biggest worry in the morning is probably getting out of bed without falling over, never mind sort of overthrowing the government. So that's a really, really big one. And then there are implications about the uses of products and services, like, poor eyesight, arthritic hands, tired knees, knackered knees. But circling back and making a sort of practical point, I find that the younger people entering the workforce and the older people that are either just leaving it or are re-entering it because they've run out of money, because obviously the longer you live, the more money you need. They're all after the same thing, which is around sort of personalization of contracts and conditions and some sort of latitude and freedom around how they work, where they work, taking time off and all the rest of it. So, impacts on the future of work, impacts on the future of retail. We still we over-engineer products. We make them too complex, possibly because it impresses our engineer friends. Older people like big buttons and big typefaces, and the pandemic. In the UK, we had this whole alert system, track and trace. It only worked on modern smartphones. My parents, both in their early 90s, they don't even own a smartphone.
Right.
So they couldn't use it. I've got an old smartphone. Even I was struggling with some of the stuff.
So if these are some of the more, I guess we could say, like, ubiquitous or grand megatrends that are going to be impacting the world over the next 25, 30 years or so. We talked a little bit before the recording of some of these kind of smaller, maybe more unique trends or technologies that I think most people aren't aware of. And this is something that I really like to do on the podcast, right? Like, I have a list of maybe some 300 technologies of things that I wasn't aware of even like last week for some of them. So are there any kind of unique things that you're aware of that you think most people would be like fascinated by, scared of, that you like to share?
As you say, with the megatrends, kind of everyone's aware of them more or less. They're important, but they're not urgent, so people kind of ignore them. And even if you are addressing them, you're just kind of like trimming the sails to make sure the boat's sailing as well as it could. The opportunities and risks lie in these emerging trends, the smaller ones, and the counter trends and the weak signals. I'm very interested in digital trust as a sort of subset of decline of trust. It's not on that map because the map's too old, but this expected future, the official future of Silicon Valley doesn't work if you don't have digital trust. And by digital trust, I mean agreements over privacy, agreement over whose data it is and how it can be used, and how stable things are. Am I getting hacked every other week? And without digital trust, that all, to my mind, it all collapses. So that's an interesting one. It's a boring one, but I think debt is really interesting to watch, and that's why I'm worried we will get another crash, not if.
Yeah.
I would say that to some extent is predetermined, historically speaking. It's a cycle. We don't know when, but it's going to happen, and the level of debt's a worry. You've touched on rise of Africa. If I was 22 years old right now, looking, rather than go west, young man or young woman, I'd be heading to sub-Saharan Africa. I think there's the resources, the population. The only problem with Africa is governance. It's like a lot of these regions, like India or something, there's a lot of corruption around, which makes it problematic. But there's a phenomenal amount of of opportunity there. I mean, tech-wise, I'm trying to understand and half succeeding quantum at the moment, and I think that's definitely a game changer. But I don't think it's as close as some people think it is, in terms of properly functioning proper quantum, as opposed to systems that ape quantum type. What's the word? Can't think of the word. My favorite thing at the moment is probably, or the thing I'm most interested in is brain-computer interfaces. So we've had this a while. So this is putting our headset on, is putting electrodes into somebody's skull and controlling a car, a computer, a wheelchair. And, incredibly useful if you've not got control of your arms and legs, or you can't speak or whatever. And I do think that's going to be a thing in the future. And maybe we just put on a baseball cap and we can start operating the lights by thinking. We don't even have to touch anything. So we've gone from this thing where you have to physically bash machines to get them to work. We've now got into the era where we're talking to them and they're talking to us back, although ironically we've stopped talking to people a lot of the time. Just by sort of thinking about it, and that gets you into a pretty dystopian future potentially, because that's the last bastion of privacy, mental privacy. This is very Orwellian. So you can get a letter from the police just by thinking of something you shouldn't, let alone saying it or doing or acting on something. But I think it'll have broad uses in terms of disabilities and so on. So I think that's a sort of a very interesting one. There's a lot of very interesting energy tech. There's a startup called Thin Air, which is taking air out of even water out of even the driest air. So in deserts, a bit like the old tech of having a fog curtain to capture the fog that rolls in over San Francisco. I like. There's some very science fictiony ones. I did a thing with Imperial College, a table of disruptive technologies, and we've got what we call the ghost technology fringe, which is stuff that's literally straight out of sci-fi in most cases. So it's stuff that's highly unlikely but not physically impossible. So space solar, where we collect solar in space with a bunch of mirrors and we send it back down to Earth with lasers, or I think it's microwaves is the other way of doing it. What else? I don't want to get into space elevators. That's going a bit too far. Transparent solar, that's a game changer. Every single window in every building on Earth is a solar panel, and it's transparent. Total game changer. Because if energy becomes that abundant, you can make water, and if you've got water, you can grow food anywhere, pretty much. So that's the energy one. The short term thing I'm very interested in, and it could be very transformational, is smart contact lenses. So I think Google have a patent on this. They've had it for years, actually. Rather than these ridiculous glasses that people don't like wearing, and although that doesn't seem to stop Facebook doing it again with Ray-Ban, it's just in the contact lens. You put them in, nobody can see you're wearing them. So you've got a heads-up display. Obviously, hugely useful for law enforcement or surgeons or plumbers, where you can call up bits of information while you've got your hands stuck on something or on someone. Could it have broader appeal? Yes, I think it probably could. Whether it would be societally acceptable, I don't know, which circles back to the earlier point about not just looking at the tech. I mean, there was nothing wrong with Google Glass. From memory, you couldn't do facial recognition with Google Glass, but everyone thought you could. So, and then the thing that killed it really was the phrase glass hole, as far as I can remember it. The human reaction, the psychological reaction to this stuff can and does restrain or throw things out. I mean, there are technologies we invent that we decide we don't want anymore, or we restrain them very significantly. So just because it's invented doesn't mean it's a dead cert. I mean, it's tricky to put stuff back in a box sometimes, but if you legislate against something, we can restrain that. I mean, other stuff, I need the table in front of me really, but I like smart nappies, by the way. That's a good one. They're around. By the way, the disruptive table is not stuff that might get invented. It's all been invented, more or less. We were talking about ubiquity or commonality. Yeah. And the thing that's least impactful and now is smart nappies. So pretty obvious, wet nappy, pooey nappy, you get a text, change the nappy. And everyone thinks babies, but then you circle back to the demographic aging thing, and that could be me in 30 years. Distasteful thought, but that's the future to some extent. There's a Japanese nappy company. They sell more nappies now to people over 65 than babies. Now you might not like that future, but it's coming. unless we get some weird thing where all the older people get knocked out by a pandemic, which we got close to that. I'm trying to think what else is out there. Oh, grief. Precision agriculture is really interesting. Vertical agriculture up to a point. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess the general sense here is that there's a ton of these new, interesting, game-changing technologies, but also things that can disrupt certain industries. I mean, we have a little bit more time here, so I want to kind of maybe drill down a little bit on one of the things that you said. I mean, I could have you on here all day and we could talk about this stuff for the whole day. But I have had a couple guests talk about this brain machine interface or this neurotech, but I would think that there's not sufficient discussion out there about the negative ramifications. So I believe there was just a couple months ago, there was a video that was going slightly viral of organizations being able to use these types of helmets or baseball caps, as you were saying, in order to measure brainwave activity and knowing whether you're either scrolling Facebook, or I guess it would be TikTok nowadays, or whether you're actually doing your work. Have you talked to people that are developing this, or organizations that are starting to think about using this in the next, I guess, 5 years, 10 years, or something like that?
Not specifically with brain machine interface, brain computer interface, but I've had lots of discussion with AI folks about the ethics. It's we can do just about anything these days. The question is, should we be doing it? And I think this is why we're getting philosophers and ethicists involved in some of this tech. I mean, what I think we tend to do is we invent stuff, and it's a bit like the hype cycle. Gartner hype cycle. We constantly overshoot and have to claw it back. And the future isn't some sort of nice, lovely little progression. It's a series of advances followed by frantic retreats, and we get a sort of zigzag pattern going through. But I think that's going to be increasingly the case about, is this a good idea in two particular areas, AI and genetics. Because we can do this stuff. Whether it's a good idea. I mean, even at a mundane level, do we want AI disrupting the legal profession? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. If we decide we don't want that, we might restrain it from a legal point of view. I mean, Italy recently has just basically outlawed or restrained ChatGPT. We could see much more of that stuff going on, and whether it's doing harm. I mean, if I was being naughty, I might suggest we don't really even need these interfaces, because Meta and Google, and they already know what we think, right? I mean, they know what we think. They know what we're going to do next, at some level. Although again, that's not sort of destiny necessarily, and we're beginning to see people thinking, I didn't realize they were doing that. I'm not sure I'm going to use this anymore. And again, look at sort of the weak signals and early adopters, or I don't know what the opposite. What's the word for the opposite of an early adopter? So people that throw things away first. So I know plenty of people in AI that don't own phones. Which is staggering.
Oh, like almost counter trend individuals. I don't know the specific term, but something like that.
It's kind of a weak signal counter trend. Yeah, it's kind of somewhere mixed up in that pushbacky. In that area. So I think a lot of this stuff is going to be, hopefully. I mean, I hope it's going to get more widely discussed. I mean, we might end up, if we go down the route of geoplanetary engineering, where we're doing giant engineering projects to counter climate change. This is the sort of thing which will need that debate as well, because of the scale of unintended consequences potentially. And as most of the problems we've got, the big problems are global problems, and we need broad discussion about how to address things, how to deal with them, how not to deal with them, and so on and so forth. Sadly, we don't really get enough of that. But I think the days of tech just being produced in a vacuum or in isolation are sort of dying. Really, I think there are broader considerations to be had, and that applies to business in general. I think. I mean, I did a 2x2 scenario set early pandemic about the future of globalization, and one axis was around chaos versus and control of natural systems, primarily climate, but also things like biodiversity, topsoil erosion, and so on. And the other axis was around profit versus principle. And I think we are slowly moving away from, if I can broadly call it, the American model, where it is how much money can you make over a shortest period of time. End of. No worry about broader consequences, to a more of a European model, which is a sort of a broader consideration of your health of your employees, of your local community, the planet. So again, that I think even business, even if you're not in tech, I think you're gonna have to contend with questions about harm and potential harm, and we see this around resources for sure, but I think it's going to go a lot further than that. I hope it's going to go a lot further than that.
Yeah. I've heard, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard that this is also part of this idea of the fifth industrial revolution, right? So it's not necessarily a new set of technologies, a new set of disruptive trends, and et cetera, but it's more kind of a reversal on, I guess you could call it this American profit-seeking model, and it's more about, focusing on the welfare of the employees, focusing on the welfare of the environment, et cetera. I don't think it's a like ubiquitous term yet, but it's
I don't want to paint it purely as a US thing. I think it originated in the US. I mean, I think a lot of people now are beginning to just question growth for growth's sake. Endless growth is problematic on tremendous number of levels, and I think that's coming onto the agenda more and more these days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. To shift gears here a little bit. So I know that you've been working with tons of organizations over the last decade or 2 decades that you've been doing this for. What is your kind of general sense of the individuals that you're working with, right? So we talked about people that are working in tech. Of course, they're aware of all this. Do you get a general sense that most people in most organizations are at least relatively aware of the things that are going on, megatrends, technology, otherwise, or are people so focused on their kind of day-to-day lives, on the work that they have to do, that this is kind of out of sight, out of mind?
It's a bit like climate change was 20 years ago. They're kind of aware of it, but there's a feeling they don't really have to deal with it right now. And B, as you say, they just haven't got time. They are doing 3 people's jobs right now. They have not got time to sit back and think about something that potentially is 20 or 30 years away. But even something as basic as societal aging, which gets a lot of coverage, I don't think that's particularly in people's heads. And then if you really sort of push to sort of the edge of things, so, look at surveillance capitalism or something, I think most people have no idea what's going on, quite frankly. And they just think it's personalized ads. They don't really get where that could go, and they haven't got they just haven't got the bandwidth, quite frankly. And also, I mean, bear in mind, a lot of this stuff is this is a disruptive profession. If you start questioning, everything somebody's doing or an organization's doing, you're not terribly popular. I mean, it sort of overlaps with innovation there quite a lot, because if you sort of come up with a new thing that's sort of destroying the current paradigm, you're generally not terribly welcome. But it's useful. I mean, I think having the Israeli Defense Force has a sort of effectively a head of no. That's if the troop agrees on something, their job is to disagree to increase the quality of the decision. I think some Japanese companies have the sort of head of no idea, and it's just in there, just trying to force better discussion and get better decisions coming out. But I think people are just consumed at the moment. They're just hanging on with their fingernails in a lot of instances. They have not got time for all this stuff.
Yeah, that's unfortunately my though significantly lesser experience than yours, but that's generally my experience as well. Just having discussions.
I've noted, I mean, you say, I think it's probably, how long have I been doing this? I've been doing this since almost 2000, it's almost 20 years, 19 years. And it's quite fun to look back at because writing books, you can actually read what you were thinking.
Sure.
And it does seem like the things we're worrying about today, we won't be worrying about next year. You will have moved on, and it wasn't the end of the world. We dealt with it, and now we're worried about something else. And I feel that sort of quite strongly, actually. And there is even a strategy to just ignore things on the basis they go away. Not everything, obviously, but some things. And we get caught up with this. We get a lot of firefighting going on, the sort of the detail that doesn't really matter. But you look at Warren Buffett, he doesn't make very many decisions, but he thinks deeply about them, and he's thinking very long term ahead, and he doesn't change his mind very often. And I think with tech, you have got to have a view of the future, because you're trying to build a world that doesn't yet exist. You are going to get people objecting to what you're trying to do. And you just got to keep going anyway. Although I think you do have to ask yourself whether this is generally a good thing, or might have some bad consequences as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe a follow-up conversation with that, and also to tie that back into kind of the initial conversation that we had. How relevant is it for this constructivist sense of we're able to change the future? Is it how important is it for kind of the average person working in corporations or businesses to be aware of this? If the Warren Buffetts and the Elon Musks and the tech developers out there are making the real changes, is it really important for the average person to become aware of all these things, or is the future just going to come to them and they're going to have to deal with it anyways?
I'm almost going to quote you some Marcus Aurelius, but I can't remember the quote. But I think it's along the lines of, we will deal with the future with the same weapons of something or others we've dealt with the past or something.
Yeah.
I think the broader point is the more important one, which is like, with all the sort of the trends and the mega trends and the micro trends, we will deal with them. And I'm confident we'll deal with them just fine, broadly speaking. The bigger point outside of organizations, although you can't be totally outside an organization, but I'm just thinking about sort of people in the street really, and families and couples and whatever. I do think it's really important to have the right mindset about this, and I think that the future. I think a lot of people, depending on where you are, right? So I think this is less true somewhere like Shanghai than it would be in Milwaukee or something, but the future is seen as that sort of the giant ball in Raiders of the Lost Ark that's coming towards down the tunnel, and you basically, it's going to flatten you, or it's a giant wave, and you've either got to sort of duck out under it, or you've got to get on top of it and ride it, which is kind of a negative, reactive, almost passive mindset. Actually, like, the future's coming, there's nothing I can do with it. Oh, what's coming? What's coming? How am I going to deal with it? Oh my God, how are we going to respond to AGI if it happens, or even AI, narrow AI? A much more positive mindset is to, clearly you've got to think about what's coming, because to be forearmed is to be be forewarned is to be forearmed. It helps you to see things coming and to have strategies in your head about how you might deal with things. But I think the more important thing to do, rather than worrying about what might happen and how you might deal with it, is to have discussions at a household, corporate, countrywide, global level about, well, what do we want the future to be like? And let's try and create it. Let's try and build it. And that is the history of entrepreneurs and innovators and engineers forever, really. It's like, I've got a vision of doing it a better way. And I think at some level, what we want around the world is pretty similar, actually. And one of the problems we have at the moment is the future is being invented by, say, a bunch of young white guys. And if I'm being a little unkind, a lot of whom are on the spectrum, they're inventing a future that suits them. It's absolutely fine, but don't impose it on everybody else, because it might not fit with them. So I think it's really important that we create a future or futures that are sort of fair and inclusive and work for everyone. And that, I'm talking about ages, I'm talking about genders, I'm talking about cultures. And everyone really wants the same thing, which is they want a sort of safe, fair place for to grow up in, and their kids, if they happen to grow up in, and not to do too much damage to the environment, leave the world a better place, all that stuff. There are sort of things that we sort of, I think, can agree on, and we can try to move in that direction. And that's a positive thing. But that's not very common at the moment. And there's a lot of people think, with climate change, that we're all doomed, which I don't share that at all. I think that's highly, highly, highly unlikely. So I'm sort of longer term pretty very optimistic, actually. I think we've got some issues short term without a shadow of a doubt, but longer term I'm pretty optimistic, and I struggle to see how you can get out of bed in the morning if you're not optimistic. Actually, it must be quite difficult.
Yeah Well, that was going to be my last question for you, whether you're optimistic about the future or pessimistic.
I think short term, we've got some issues. I mean, the Russia situation and China are deeply worrying. We're creating some quite dangerous tech, and I'm not just talking about AI. In fact, I'm not really talking about AI at all. I'm thinking more in the area of genomics. Geopolitically, it's quite unstable. Yes, climate change and resources, but I think they're all pretty solvable. But I think long term, I would say it's looking pretty bright. I'm funny if I'm writing, being contracted to write a book on the future for kids, and the reason I'm writing it with my science fiction writer friend. The reason we've got contracted is it's entirely optimistic. There's no negativity in it, and I think there's I don't know about adults, but with kids, there's a real thirst for that right now.
Yeah, oh, that's very interesting. Well, Richard, I see that the time's also winding down here. I think that's a really positive message for a lot of the listeners, because I know that in my own conversations, both in and outside of the podcast, there is this, I think it goes beyond future shock, right? It's this cloud of doubt and uncertainty and fear about the future, because we are, I think, inundated with a lot of these kind of more negative aspects of technological impact. So I'm really happy to hear that you're a little bit more hopeful for the future there. I'll have your website, nowandnext.com, up on the show notes. Is there any other way that you like or you prefer to be contacted by people?
You get to me through the website, or I'm on LinkedIn. The other thing that your audience in particular might want to look at beyond the subway map is the table of disruptive technologies that was done with Imperial College, which is mostly serious. There's the odd joke in it. That's worth a look. LinkedIn or just through the website nowandnext.com. Happy to answer any questions individually as well if people want to reach out.
Perfect. Great. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Richard. Really interesting things, and I'll have to have some more discussions with some friends around here and roll over some of the ideas that you've put forward. So thanks again for your time. Thanks for coming onto the podcast, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks for having me on, Mark. Thanks a lot.
So, thanks for listening to this week's Future Tech and Foresight podcast. If you like what you've heard, here are a number of ways that you can go out and support the podcast. The best way would be to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or even give a rating on Spotify, which you can find a step-by-step explanation for on the futuretechandforesight.com website. Alternatively, feel free to leave a comment either on the episode show notes on the website or the YouTube channel, where you can also see video recordings of each of the interviews. And finally, if you are part of an organization that is aware of the disruptive and transformational impact that emerging and future technologies will bring and want to know more, you can get in touch with me to hear about the strategic foresight services I offer and how I can help future-proof your organization and take advantage of the phenomenal opportunities available to survive and thrive in the future.
A lot of future-shocked people and future-shocked institutions in our society are simply overwhelmed.
Once there is superintelligence, the fate of humanity may depend on what the superintelligence does.
Science fact is catching up to science fiction.
The first truly intelligent machine will be the last invention that humanity needs to make.
The only scarcity that will exist in the future is that which we decide to create ourselves as humans.
Within a 10-year design revolution, we can have all humanity living at the highest standard of living anybody's ever known.
Progress is accelerating at an exponential pace, and it's going to reach a point where progress is so fast it's going to be a singularity.
We are probably one of the last generations of Homo sapiens.
Every single headline points to the birth pangs of a Type 1 civilization.